In 1946, two telegrams changed the course of history. One from an American diplomat, the other from his Soviet counterpart. Contained within are all the analyses, biases, and prejudices that would shape America and Europe's relationship for nearly a century, dividing a continent.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent,
uniting whole economies.
I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid,
and leading to the creation of an alliance that would prove the ultimate guarantee of the West's security, NATO.
The single greatest, most effective defensive alliance in the history of the world.
The gravity of the situation which confronts the world today necessitates my appearance before a joint session of the Congress.
In March 1947, President Harry S. Truman asks Congress for $400 million in military and economic assistance for Greece and Turkey as they resist communism. But he does so in strikingly broad terms.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure.
Assistance is given to the Greek and Turkish governments, but what Truman actually does is commit America to assisting democracies wherever they may be.
I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way.
This foreign policy commitment will become known as the Truman Doctrine. It will lead to the United States committing to rebuild Europe and the binding of American and European security. This fundamental shift in the transatlantic relationship is due to events set in motion nearly 3 years earlier as the Second World War continued to rage.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
Their purpose is to set the stage for the post-war economic order, one that would prevent the kind of global disarray that helped create war.
To be discussed are plans for the stabilization of world currencies. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nations involved before becoming effective.
The conference is a big success. To foster predictable international trade, participants agree to peg their currencies to the US dollar, the value of which will be based on the more reliable value of gold. The International Monetary Fund is created to provide countries with short-term loans, while the newly established World Bank will finance the reconstruction of post-war Europe. These institutions will survive to the present day, but when it comes to ratifying the agreement after the war's end, there will be one notable absence. Initially, the Soviet Union's officials had studied and favoured the proposals, recognising the potential economic benefits. But one person did not: Stalin. Stalin's refusal to ratify the agreement causes confusion in America, and so they consult an expert. By 1946, George Kennan has been working for the US Foreign Service for 20 years, and through postings in places like Latvia and Moscow, has gained an insight into the Soviet Union that few of his contemporaries possess. And so when the US Treasury asks the State Department to explain the Soviet Union's odd behaviour, the request lands on Kennan's desk. Kennan replies with what will become known as the Long Telegram, as in a little over 5,000 words, he explains the thoughts, motivations, and ideology of the USSR. He says that the Soviet Union is committed to the idea that it cannot coexist with the United States, and that it will do all it can to set Western powers against each other. He says that Stalin wants to disrupt American society, that he needs the world to be hostile in order to justify his own cruel dictatorship. And he says that Europeans are seeking security, and if they don't get it from America, then the USSR will step in. Kennan's telegram is a wake-up call to the American government, and the result is the strategy of containment, the idea being to not allow communism to spread any further, leaving the inevitable weaknesses of the communist ideology to bring about its own destruction. A few months later, Nikolai Novikov, the Soviet Union's ambassador to the United States, sends a telegram to Stalin. In it, he explains the thoughts, motivations, and ideologies of the USA. He says that the United States wants nothing less than to rule the whole world. That in order to do this, America would take advantage of Europe's economic troubles to send over enormous amounts of goods and capital in order to infiltrate their national economies. That the rapid expansion of their military also points to this objective. And that America wants to limit the Soviet Union's influence in its own neighbours in order to introduce American capital into their economies. For Stalin, the telegram is confirmation that the US is his country's enemy. It fuels his own determination to enhance the Soviet military and develop his own atomic weapons. And it increases his desire to create a buffer zone of satellite states in Eastern Europe to shield the Soviet Union from potential Western attack. And so with these two telegrams, the United States and the Soviet Union each feel they have the measure of the other. And now, whether real, imagined, or a mixture of the two, they would begin to act on their analyses. And the result will be to divide the world in two and bind America and Europe together. It is Kennan's telegram that begins the political debate that results in the Truman Doctrine.
We must take immediate and resolute action,
which soon leads to US Secretary of State George Marshall announcing the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan.
We must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character.
Realizing that the gravest threat to American interests in Europe is that poverty and despair will lead to Europeans voting communists into power, the US commits to nothing less than the reconstruction of Europe.
Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos.
But for the Soviet Union, the Marshall Plan is the Novikov telegram coming true. It's no benevolent aid for Europe, but rather an instrument of American economic and political dominion. Not help for a war-torn continent, but conquest disguised as assistance. And Stalin reacts just as Kennan's telegram predicts he will. He tightens his grip wherever he can. He establishes the Communist Information Bureau, Cominform, to coordinate the actions of European communist parties. He approves a plan by Czechoslovakian communists to seize power in the only Eastern European state that has remained democratic. And he then makes his boldest move yet, the one that will lead to America making commitments to European security that are with us to this day.
The next point of tension, Berlin.
With Germany's defeat at the end of the Second World War, the victorious Allies had agreed to divide the country into 4 temporary zones of occupation. The capital, Berlin, was also divided, with the added complication that it lay deep within Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany. This means that access for the West depends on Soviet goodwill, and with tensions mounting, that goodwill runs out.
Barely 5 months after the coup d'etat in Prague, the Russians unilaterally decided to isolate Western Berlin and cut its supply routes which crossed the Soviet zone of Germany. Trains, barges, and road traffic was stopped.
With Stalin having cut West Berlin off, the West has 2 choices: to leave the entire city to the Soviets, or to stay but risk the starvation of the people within the British, American, and French sectors. Refusing to give in to the Soviet Union, the West has only one feasible way to supply the blockaded city: from above.
The West were responsible for almost 2.5 million people. And to supply a city of this size would mean mounting the biggest airlift of all time.
And that is exactly what they do. Over the next 11 months, more than 2.3 million tons of fuel, food and medicine are flown into West Berlin. At the height of the airlift, a plane lands at the city's Tempelhof airport every single minute. Stalin, not wanting to start World War III, particularly since he doesn't have nuclear weapons, can do little but watch. The Western powers pull off what seems impossible, supplying an entire city by air alone. They win the gratitude of the Berliners, it's a global PR triumph, and it makes Stalin look both brutal and incompetent. But more importantly in the long term, it helps turn an Anglo-European economic partnership into a security alliance. Given the events in Europe, the United States begins to worry that the Europeans might handle their security concerns by negotiating with Stalin. To counter this possibility, Truman thinks more and more about forming a European-American alliance to commit the United States to the security of Western Europe. The concept of collective security is not foreign to the Europeans. Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg had already come together in 1948 to create the Western Union, which committed them to come to each other's aid should they be attacked. And now Truman wants in on it. More than that, he wants to enlarge the treaty to include the countries of the North Atlantic. Taken together, these territories form a bridge between the opposite shores of the Atlantic, enabling military action should it become necessary. After months of negotiations, the result is the North Atlantic Treaty.
Today, the United States, keenly aware of its strategic role as a leader in the free world, has allied itself with other nations, dedicated to the preservation of peace and the welfare of mankind.
Kennan's long telegram had had a profound effect on American foreign policy. It had led to that initial aid for Greece and Turkey, which had grown into an economic package to fund the rebuilding of Europe, and had now become a military alliance binding American and European security. For the Soviet Union, NATO is an example of the Western imperialism that Novikov wrote about. But Stalin would soon have his own reasons to be cheerful. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union scientists present him with his greatest desire, his own atomic bomb. The successful test is a shock to the Americans, who had believed their nuclear monopoly would last at least a few more years. And so Truman quietly sanctions the building of more atomic bombs in order to maintain its lead over the USSR, before publicly announcing his intentions to build what was then called a super bomb, but what we now know of as a hydrogen bomb, at least 1,000 times more powerful than the weapons that had devastated Japan. Advances in the technology and delivery of nuclear weapons are about to usher in the era of mutually assured destruction. But for America and Europe, it would be events on the other side of the world that would lead to the next phase of their relationship and turn their mutual defense treaty into the NATO we know today.